Good morning, folks. My name is Max Kennedy. As I mentioned, I'm the Northwestern Regional Coordinator for Vermont Emergency Management. I am one of three, what I consider the Vermont Emergency Management customer service reps for local or any organization that's not state or federal. So I cover Chittenden, Franklin, Grand Isle, and Addison counties for all things emergency management. That entails helping folks out with plan development, conducting trainings or exercises, helping out during the response of an incident, or one of the things we do is we also conduct what's called an incident review. And I was asked to come in and talk about what that is and what that process looks like. And at any point, if you have any questions online, please feel free to just drop them in the chat box. We are going to have a slot for questions at the end of this. And I know that there's some challenges with the virtual component as well. So if you're in person and you prefer to just do it face to face, I'll be available after this as well. And I'll turn on my camera at the end for questions so you can see what I look like. So for objectives, what I'm going to cover, one is to familiarize you with the fundamentals of incident review. So what it is and what it is not, why we conduct them, who should be involved, and when to conduct them. And overall, just hopefully everyone leaves with a warm and fuzzy on what this is and, hopefully also why you should do it and get into the practice of doing it. We're going to cover best practices and helpful resources. So when you get to the point of wanting to do it, how you can start and what it looks like. So what exactly are we talking about? For those that have never heard the term incident debrief and you were hoping to learn something that you've never heard of before and it'll be completely brand new to you, I hate to say it, you may be disappointed in a second because you're likely fairly familiar with what we're talking about. Just may have heard it called something else. So some people call it incident review, incident debrief, after action review, hot wash, after action debriefing, a look back, retrospective meeting. At the end of the day, depending on your organization, the content, that it's all the same thing. We're talking about the same thing. There might be different nuances in terms of specifics or when you do it. For our organization particularly, we have incident reviews and then we have hot washes. They're pretty close to the same thing, but the context is different. So your organization, whether it be a post-mortem or a after-action debriefing, you likely have heard some phrase that talks about and captures the overall intent of what we're talking about today. Okay, so what is it? So I bolded this specifically because I want this, the first bullet to be really drive home. It's a structured process, and we're capturing information following an event or an incident. So it doesn't have to be a disaster, it could be a scheduled event, and we're codifying strengths. So we're making sure that things that went well, that we have a system in place to continue doing those things well, and then we're turning shortfalls or areas of improvement or weaknesses, whatever you want to call them, we're turning those into opportunities for improvement. And so if you've ever done an exercise, this should sound very familiar. One of the things that we do when we do exercise support following the Homeland Security Evaluation Program model is that, we do not conduct any exercises if there's not a structured, formal, documented process to capture what went well and what didn't go well. So when we're talking about incident review, when I say structured process, it's, there's a planning process, but it's also the biggest takeaway is making sure that things get written down and having those records in place to be able to reflect on later. So the goal of the process is to have clear actions to improve plans, procedures, equipment, and the incident response process. In terms of emergency management, this process can be applied to any organization, whether or not you're in emergency management. But when we look at this, ultimately, we're looking at improving our response capabilities. And at the end of the day, it's helping preserve life safety, property, and overall reduction of impact. And this is the biggest what's not. Again, if you've worked with us with exercising, this should be very familiar. But this, for folks that have never been part of the process, this requires just as much communication as the what it is. So we're not looking at evaluating people or assigning blame, grading failure. We are looking to improve plans, procedures, things, and by doing so, we're creating a learning environment. It's really making sure that folks feel comfortable to do so, and they're not feeling like it's a personality challenge. So it's again, communicating this stuff in advance will help ensure that you get the information you're looking for once you establish this after action review process. So why do we do it? The graphic is, for me, the simplest thing to summarize why we do this. It's really making sure we don't fall victim to the same traps or bump into the same areas for improvement over and over and over again. So we're taking, what's considered the gift of experience and turn it into knowledge, again, by systematically documenting it and building systems to improve. So we capture what happened, what was supposed to happen, what didn't happen, the actions that were taken, and what did not go as planned. So we're making sure that any event or incident is not a wasted learning opportunity. A lot of folks, they don't build improvement plans for real world events and they wait for exercising, but it's taking credit where credit's due, and it's taking every opportunity. So you don't have to wait for an exercise, something that you plan on doing, to help build upon it. And this is at all echelons. Everything we're talking about today is scalable. So it can be a very small 1 to 3 person response, or it could be a statewide, multi-echelon, multi-organization, event. But at the end of the day, it's no incident is too small to conduct this process. Simple example for me, when I go camping, a couple times. So I went camping and I forgot that my water purifier, it was missing a piece of, so I couldn't use it. I had to boil all my water. And it's a bummer. It's a lesson learned. And what should have happened is I should have, given the opportunity when I got home, documented what didn't go well or the things that I need to do before I go camping again. But it's unfortunately, the last time I did it, I forgot. And then by the time I needed my water purifier again, there I was, frustrated, without a working water purifier, boiling water, wasting time and energy. And it's the same level of frustration magnified when you think about any life safety event. So there's nothing more frustrating for an organization to run into issues that could have been resolved, should have been addressed, but for whatever reason they didn't go through the process, and now you have individuals run into the same obstacles that could have easily been mitigated during that recovery or preparedness phase. So the other thing I like about these documents is they kind of establish what I call as a watermark for future reference. So I work with one of the towns that I recently did one of the after action reviews with is we spent a lot of time on just talking through the data, what happened, and in a couple of years, if someone runs into an incident, or if they're doing a planning for a annex for a plan, one of the first steps they can look at is, okay, where have we been? What have we experienced for incidents, and what happened during that? So it really does give a nice platform for just establishing where the organization has been. So the other biggest thing, and this is one of the key selling points where you're talking about things like money, is this is where you can get buy-in for improvements. At times working in that preparedness phase, we are often selling ideas or theoretical improvements to folks that may not have the same level of buy-in that you do, may not get the direction you're trying to go with it. Well, at the end of the day, nothing makes something more relevant or a need more relevant than having run into the issue where maybe you didn't have enough radios, or maybe you had a power outage in the winter that impacted a critical facility like your shelter, and now you have a document that shows what happens when that happens and why you would need something like a generator. So at the end of the day, it builds relevancy for folks to be able to understand why they need to spend the money or the resources or the time investing into something, because you've shown that through experience, this is a real need. Build trust in your organization. So again, going back to that level of frustration with folks and that they can have if they keep running into the same issues. Well, by going through the process and documenting what's happening, it shows, and it's only as good as the information sharing process, but it shows that the organization is really committed. So it's one thing to get on a podium and say that our organization, our school, our town, or whatever is, we are taking emergency management or emergency preparedness seriously. Well, it's another thing to then back it up with documented steps of where you're going to go with it and what that, what taking it serious actually looks like. So it does show that it's kind of talking the talk, and in this process, it shows that you're going to walk the walk as well. And because things are limited, we are constantly dealing with finite resources. It helps prioritize resources and the direction of planning and improvements. So, you're going to have to, at some point in your process, identify priorities because many, if not all organizations I work with, they are limited in some way in terms of people power or money or things. So by identifying the impact and what it did to the organization, you're able to better see where those resources, those finite resources, should go and when. So who's involved? This is a couple of these things I'm going to get into. They are definitely a combination of art and science. So I hate to say it, but the catch-all is those involved in the response of the event. It's really up to the organization to identify at what levels they want to conduct these. So they can be a mix of organizations or echelons. I really do, we get into in best practices. I really recommend, knowing your audience. And if you feel that you're not able to have representatives speak with authority to their section, so say you have someone from the road crew, someone from fire, someone from EMS, if for whatever reason, based on what happened or personalities or other factors, if you don't feel that one person can go to one of these meetings equipped to speak on behalf of everyone, that's where you might want to look at, okay, maybe we'll conduct a separate meeting for each organization and then combine the results. It's a really, again, there's art and science in here. You do want to capture the input at every level, but you want to make sure that you're able to do so in a way where those other organizations are able to see and address the information and the feedback that you're given. So, it might be having multiple meetings and then a culminating meeting where you then look at them all together, because at the end of the day, it's easy, people get stuck in there, it's called the foxhole. So I see what's within my foxhole or my tower or my lane. It's really, you want to make sure you're able to bridge the gap and get everyone on the same page with the big picture. So it does sometimes mean breaking out groups, but it also, I highly recommend getting all echelons. So whether it be operations versus policy, try to have a venue for everyone that was involved in the response. When? This is, we don't have a solid answer. So for art and science, this is definitely art. So for hot wash, for our organization, I mentioned that, we have, some organizations will call what we're talking about a debrief hot wash. For us, we talk about a hot wash a little bit differently. So hot wash is immediately after the incident. So not during that response phase, but during that short-term recovery phase. So you want it to be as soon as you start conducting your takedown, your demobilization. This is your kind of your knee-jerk response. You want to capture information while it's fresh. So if you've done an exercise, you'll know that we often do a round table of one up, one down, or thorns and roses. This is capturing just the immediate, before folks go home, they decompress and they brain dump everything. What's on your mind short term, immediately following it. I would say one of the things I like to do for this, because oftentimes these are verbally conducted or physically, like what before people go home. Sometimes folks, you might not get the best responses because people are tired, they're burnt out, and they just, they now look at this process as you between them and their home and their family. So I oftentimes will immediately follow a hot wash with a hot wash survey. So again, it's, maybe they had their more time to collect their thoughts, but you want to be able to capture the information while it's fresh. Then we go into that formal debrief process. This is within a week to a month. It really depends. Are we talking about debriefing the response? Well, then, it's a little bit easier. If you start talking about, okay, we want to debrief the recovery process. I've been involved in some of those. you might be looking at, 3 to 9 months later. You want to make sure that you're not trying to actively debrief something that is ongoing. And, it's very different than a touch point or a, part of the planning process. We have venues during response and recovery to talk about what we're currently working on. But when we talk about debrief, we're really looking at the retrospective, what has happened in the past. So different than addressing and refining a process in place. So here's just an example debrief agenda. So introductions, ground rules. So for those that have not worked with us for like a tabletop exercise or a discussion-based exercise, ground rules are, I think, critical in this process, especially following an incident, just because at the end of the day, we've all dealt with it. These, especially real-world incidents, they can be high emotion events. You talk about flooding or fires. It's Vermont, and no matter what state you're in, there's a good chance that people in the room have had an emotional impact of some level, either through their own toll of being a responder, or maybe they had family members involved. Unfortunately, sometimes if you do talk about operational period events, it's not uncommon for folks to kind of get worn down and let emotions get the best of them. I've been to several events where folks will, unfortunately, professionalism can go out the door when you've been operating for 48 hours straight, and frustrations can lead to name calling and things like that. We want to make sure that for the debrief process, we're creating a safe, holistic learning environment where everyone is able to express themselves, but we also have to kind of check some of those previous experiences and emotions at the door, or address them. But by doing so, you're having ground rules. So what you can and cannot do, what the expectations are. Maybe they're as simple as turn your phones off, put them on silent, but it also can be anybody can call a timeout. It's establishing the overall rules of the process. We have many different examples of ground rules that we've used in the past. It's definitely important to go through the process and establish and make sure everyone's on the same page and make sure they have buy-in. So asking them if they're okay with them before they go forward. Again, this is just an example agenda. So then we review the agenda so folks know when we're going to get to what. We summarize the incident, and this is a collaborative process that we make sure we get all on the same page with that watermark. So we talk about what happened. Oftentimes, this is where you kind of deconflict the timeline because everyone had their own piece of the puzzle. One of the things we frequently do is we have everyone talk about what they did, and then you work together and you put them on a board and you build a timeline. And that'll really, again, help out with that documentation of what all happened and when. And then you get into the meat of the meeting in terms of strengths and areas for improvement. This is most folks really want to jump to areas for improvement. It's oftentimes depending on your personality or what your experiences were, myself included. I always want to focus on what can I do to get better, but you have to make sure you establish as much time for identifying the strengths. The overall process isn't intended to be a negative beat up the plan event. It's really to make sure that we establish, take kudos, whatever you want to call it, establish the strengths. And definitely, sometimes strengths have action items for follow-up because they're things that went well, but they weren't in the plan, or they weren't equipment items that were owned by the organization, but they were procured. So whatever it is, it's making sure you're given as much time and consideration for those strengths as well. And then we go through the review the hot wash recommendations. This is critical. So we do the hot wash, we do the surveys, and the hot wash in advance as a time saver and again an opportunity to collect the information while it's fresh. Making sure we revisit that, making sure that you're not voting on whether or not those considerations are valid. You're ensuring that they are not redundant, or you're not duplicating efforts through this process. You're going to tie into it and then build off of them. And then we get into, okay, what does this look like? Where do we go from here? The improvement plan. And then with that improvement plan, you review your action items and determine the follow-up. Again, this is a process. This is roughly what our debrief agenda looks like, and based on the organization, based on the needs and the overall goals, very flexible and open to other additions or omissions. So best practices. I talked about it a little bit. I cannot stress this enough. Prepare your audience. So if you're going to pull together an incident debrief, it's making sure that whoever is organizing and leading this effort, one, they're doing preparation, but they have to acknowledge that there's a fair amount of preparation involved for all parties. So prepare your audience. Make sure they know why you're getting together and what the objectives are. If you're able to share that agenda, please do. When you build those objectives, make sure you share those in advance. It really, the worst thing is for any, or personal opinion, but the worst thing for anyone showing up to a meeting is for them to think they're going to a meeting to talk about one thing or do one thing, and turns out the person that's running that meeting had a completely different direction they were going with it. And now you have one person feeling like they're wasting their time, or they're not prepared, they don't have the answers to be able to be helpful, or ultimately that it was not what they wanted to be involved with. So making sure that the folks that are involved, they fully understand everything we're talking about, why we're doing this, and what we're looking to get out of it. The other one, this can be a harder one because this is a resource. So it's assign a skilled facilitator. You can see on the left, for those that have taken a facilitation training, perfect example of what a skilled facilitator is not. So they're getting feedback, and then they are applying their own opinions, and they're saying, let's not write that down. What you meant to say, or what you really meant to say, was this. And they're ultimately extorting the opportunity to apply their own bias. So a skilled facilitator, no matter what their background, should be able to be unbiased and objective. So they help make sure that the session meets the goals. So again, prepare your audience, prepare your facilitator, let them know what your goals are. Keep the discussion on track. Again, that's really the core root of facilitation, is knowing what conversations to let go on, where they can go, and knowing which conversations don't fit within the goals or the objectives, and how to best direct that energy. If they're able to control the room through a variety of methods and tools, we have a different, whether you call them games or whatnot, they should have a toolbox of skills at their disposal. So based on certain groups, you don't really need to do much. They are just running, they're providing the information, they're taking control of the room, and that facilitator is taking a sidestep and they're letting the information flow. Other groups you might run into, based on what, whether it be personalities or the dynamics of the power in the room, they may need some coaxing, and you might need to help crack the shell and extract the information from them. The other, the second and last bullet is a big one for that preparation. They're understanding the underlying issues. So if they're a third party or outside facilitator, making sure that you equip that person with enough knowledge to be dangerous. So, I've facilitated some post-incident reviews, and one of the things that I was pulled in on, being informed on was, hey, a couple folks that are going to be there, they almost came to the point where people thought they were going to throw fists and actually get in a physical fight. It's not ideal, but making sure that if there is conflict or other underlying issues, whether it be internal, organizational, maybe there's some folks that there's an upcoming re-election, or maybe there's organizational changes where some folks think they're going to get fired. Whatever it is, it's just equipping the facilitator to know that there might be some topics that either you need to avoid, or you need to take special care or tact to just pay attention to and mitigate any risk that could come up. And then, of course, guiding participants to their own conclusion. So, like I talked about before, it's the facilitator is a position of power, making sure that that person is really is addressing the information and the feedback of the group, and they're not taking the opportunity to influence and apply their own opinions. Computer froze for a second. Sorry. Okay. Continuing on. So assigning note takers, I touched on it briefly, but everything that we are doing it's at risk of being for nothing if we're not documenting it. So have note takers throughout this process. Best practice, post those notes where all can see. Some folks, they want it's a validation that they're being heard. So if you can post the notes on sticky notes or butcher block or whiteboards, whatever have you, or even just projecting on a computer screen, have it so where people know that when they're providing feedback that those words aren't wasted and it's actually being documented. And then capturing what's said in the person's own words. Again, that's more on the effective facilitator, but it does apply to the note taker as well. Is don't paraphrasing or rephrasing things is dangerous. I think we've all heard many debates on our Constitution. Words are often open to interpretation. So, if someone says something, try to capture it verbatim. Let their words be what's captured versus potentially paraphrasing and going down a different direction with your improvements. Talked about it, establishing the timeline of events. So folks that know, the watermark. So you can also, if you have a similar event later, you can look at, okay, what varied, or what was our response time difference, things like that. And then limit the discussion to construction conversation. Sometimes harder to do, but positive tone, avoiding aggressive statements, avoid storytelling. Again, this really boils down to the skills of your facilitator. Have an agenda, again, critical, keeps folks on time. So valuing the time, if you're not able to meet the agenda, you can put it out to a vote and continue on, or you can reschedule and can pick up where you left off, but have something so folks know, and can rely on what you're doing and when you're doing it. And then guidelines, utilizing them, making sure that you're actually sticking to those guidelines, and then adjusting the session for the number of participants. So we talked about the surveying as pre-work to save time. The other thing you can do is you can have breakout sessions, or based on organization, or you can even break it down based on the timeline. So like, let's talk about this one component at this session, and then we'll talk about this other component at another session. There's a lot of different ways to break this out and facilitate. Again, it's based on the needs of the organization and who else coming to the table. These are pretty straightforward. What questions are you going to ask? So again, we really want to know what happened. And this is, you may get differing opinions. This is not always cut and dry, fact-based. There's a lot of different viewpoints. So what happened, you might end up running into a scenario where it's contested, and that's something you have to work through, but you want to make sure what you document something it is established and agreed upon. So what went well? Fairly straightforward. How can we sustain that strength? So if it's not in the plan, maybe the strength is that we used the plan. So what does that look like? So is it a training, whatever? Again, strengths get as much consideration as areas for improvement, so you can make sure that they don't fall off for the next opportunity. So stumbling block, areas for improvement, whatever you want to call it, weakness. It's touching on those. What would we do differently? So this is where you kind of have the retrospective viewpoint that you don't get until it's over. But hey, looking back, what do we think we would do differently and why? And then build that into your improvement plan as well. And then how can we make positive change? What does that change look like? So the improvement plan. So we take those observations, strengths and areas for improvement, and then we consider the recommendations. Always, whenever possible, try to build the root cause analysis. This can be time consuming, but it really does help when you look at where you're going to take those resources in terms of improvement, or codifying the strengths. Where do you spend that time? So here's an example where it talks about there's a puddle on the floor. So the overhead pipe is leaking. Okay, so why is that pipe leaking? Well, there's too much water pressure. Okay, so what do we do for that? There's a faulty control valve. And why is it faulty? Well, it turns out control valves aren't tested. So the root cause was ultimately, it's not that the pipe just failed, it's that control valves are not on the maintenance schedule. So going through these areas for improvement, this can be very time consuming, and it also, it doesn't mean you can skip action items or improvement items during that process. You might, tie in improvements for that second step, or, there's too much water pressure, but don't stop there. Whenever possible, try to dig down to ultimately where it ends as the root cause. And then identify methods to make improvements. So action items, who takes charge of that? This is sometimes harder when you're talking about like a small municipality, when you only have a few folks. It can be a little intimidating when you have a list of 30 items and a limited pool of resources in terms of people, but ultimately have someone in charge of that item. It doesn't mean they have to physically do it, but they're the one that you can go to and say, has anything changed? What's the update? They're the ones coordinating it. And then ideally an improvement timeline. These improvement plans are living documents like most of our response plans. So, if you don't meet that timeline, that doesn't mean don't do it. It just means revisit and look at, okay, well, how much time do you realistically need? So what does one look like? Pretty straightforward. Again, if you've seen an exercise, you can pretty much use any template or format that you want. The biggest thing is making sure that it has the information and it is documented. So here's an example where you have the observation title, the corrective action description, again, being as specific as possible. So if John Smith, the crew chief, leaves the organization, well, the completion date hasn't happened or has happened. Someone who's taken John Smith's place should be able to look at this improvement plan, and they should understand why we're doing it and what the improvement actually looks like. Track progress. This is oftentimes the harder thing to do. So you have your owner to your improvement plan. They're the ones that are actively updating this process. So whether it be every month, every quarter, whatever your meeting schedule looks like, have someone who reviews this improvement plan and just, are we still on track? Or has something else happened where we've identified that, no, actually, we don't think this is the direction we want to go in, or it's no longer the priority. Address it. Don't just let these things fall into decay and just turn into, legacy documents. They should be living documents that are constantly being reviewed and updated. And then communicate status, even if it's not progress. That's a key point that I will talk about, anytime I get with an organization, and just like in a real event, communicate something, even if it's not good news, or even if it's, we'll let you know in another month. Don't let the silence or the void take over the narrative. So if you have folks that participated in this process and they were in the improvement plan and they did the hot wash and they gave all their feedback, don't let silence, get the best of them where they now think that that was a wasted time. They know the radios never got purchased. They don't have them, but let them know, where you are with that improvement item. Don't let the silence take over the narrative. It'll always find a way to spin out of control. If you just let them know, hey, unfortunately, didn't make it the budget this year, but we're going to check back on it in 6 months, that's fine. But communicate where you are with it versus leaving it in silence. So resources to help. There's a few resources out there. I just want to highlight a couple specifically. One, the regional coordinators, myself and my two counterparts. So there's, no matter where you are within Vermont, there is someone that is available to help, whether it be just providing templates or actually facilitating. And I'd also say that, based on your organization, don't be shy about reaching out to your peers. So whether it be another town as an EMD or another school, whatever it is, your peers also could be a great venue for knowledgeable facilitators. But again, making sure that there is some training involved to be a facilitator. It's not, there are some people that are naturally good at it, but at the end of the day, the training, which we have available and it's posted when we do, that's a venue for facilitation. I cannot stress enough is, there's a lot of different ways to get training for effective facilitation. But if you're able to, at all levels, try to hop on one of those trainings. There's a ton of information on YouTube as well for facilitation techniques. It'll be helpful even if you aren't the facilitator for an after action review or an incident review. It'll pay dividends in your planning process or facilitation for any type of meeting. So questions? Again, I know that there's a challenge sometimes with just leveraging technology. If you're online, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat. If you're in the room, please work with the room host to get your question for everyone. Or if you prefer, come find me after this. I'll be outside in a green tie, and I'll turn on my camera now.
So Max, I'll get us kicked off with a comment that's in the chat. There was a note, perhaps ensure a psychologically safe space for all folks to feel that they can safely share their perspective. Thank you for naming the importance of skill facilitation. So to the right, oh, go ahead, Max.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I would say, you know, a lot of that has to do with is acknowledging that up front and communicating that. You know, it's making sure that there's no, yes, definitely communicate that in advance and throughout the process.
Excellent. So is there anyone in the room that has any questions for Max Kennedy, our Northwest Regional Coordinator? Go ahead.
Is there any value, like the fire departments, the group that you're looking to do a debrief with, is there any value to have that debrief held away from this fire station?
Max, were you able to hear the question?
Yes, so absolutely. I think, you know, it really depends on the dynamic. If folks, you know, this is really knowing your audience. Yes, I'd say that there's a good opportunity to have it outside of the organization, just for the fact that, you know, much like having a third-party facilitator, sometimes simply just changing the location really helps solidify the point that this is a neutral, you know, safe space, if you will. So yes, sometimes just simple things like moving the location of the meeting can certainly help build that, reinforce that feeling.
Go ahead, Prescott.
Looking good, Max. My question is related to your early slide about those involved in the debrief should be those that were involved in the incident. My question selfishly is, do you have any, as a facilitator, do you have any suggestions or recommendations for how those not involved in the incident might be able to benefit from some of that debrief? Obviously, in many cases, some topics come up that need to be, you know, retained in that smaller group, but from a learning perspective globally, yeah, you know, any tips, tricks, suggestions?
Absolutely. So there's a couple different things you can do for that, and I'm glad you brought it up, because I think it's great to learn from your own mistakes. It's even better given the opportunity to learn from the mistakes of others. So there's a couple things you can do is, and this is depending on the organization. One thing you can do is you can share the documentation with your peers or interested parties. This one is I get mixed results on. So sometimes, again, based on the organization, this is viewed as, you know, airing your dirty laundry. So it's really whatever. If you're going to do that, you want to make sure that folks are aware of that in advance. Some of these things can be considered very private or personal. You know, your facilitator, in my mind, they don't own any of the product that they document. So making sure that if it is going to be shared, it's well known, and given the opportunity, maybe there's some redactions. The other thing you can do, and it goes into the ground rules, is much like in an exercise, you can establish roles. One of those roles might be an observer for the process. So you can have folks that are participating or as a, you know, observer, and it's really building out, okay, who's in the room? All right, these folks, you know, like an exercise, you call them players, and then you have observers. Well, if you've done an exercise, you know observers do not influence or get involved. And, you know, so for your ground rules, you might have participants and observers and then talking through. So as an observer, are you allowed to or able to provide comment? And if so, when? So it would be establishment of roles if they're allowed to be, if they're able to come to the table and just watch and talk through, but also having a conversation of, you know, what does that look like as an observer? I'd say, you know, there's opportunity to provide suggestions for improvements, because I don't think you necessarily have to be there to help out with coming up with ideas to improve. But, you know, maybe the rule is do not take a backseat for the timeline or the, you know, what happened, because if we know that they weren't involved, they probably won't be a great source of the fact base what happened. Does that help?
Okay, Prescott is giving me the all good, so thank you. We do have another question in the chat. I'd love to learn about the ways in which debrief sessions are grounded in equity, if possible. Thank you.
Yeah, so there's different ways to do that. So one of the ways is how are you gathering the information? This is again boils down to effective facilitation and the challenge. So you can do different things like the pre-surveys, which can be anonymous. You can make sure that a lot of it has to do with ensuring that the voices of those involved and are participating have venues. It's not as easy as going around the table and saying, okay, you're up, provide your comments, because some folks do not thrive in being called out on the spot, but some folks do. So it's having that ability to read the room, but ensuring that you have a multitude of venues to get the information provided. There's really no one size fits all. So for that equity, it's ensuring that you have addressed different opportunities to collect the information. And full disclosure, I am continually learning this process. I've taken many facilitation trainings, but I don't consider myself a subject matter expert. It's an evolution. I'm continually learning. So if anyone also wants to share different techniques or thoughts, please feel free to share.
And I'll just jump in here. Another way is how you design the survey, making sure you have a diverse group that's actually figuring out the words you're going to use when you're reaching out to folks, so that it's not an intimidating survey and it's spoken in language that makes sense to them. So that's another way that you can increase equity through this process. Any other questions in the room? Okay, seeing no questions in the room and seeing none in the chat, if everyone could join me in thanking Max Kennedy for his presentation today. Thank